agency team to deal with the existing historical and contested pending bills. Significant progress has been made to settle some of the pending bills. I direct all principal secretaries and accounting officers to clear all pending bills in the MDAs and SAGAs, respectively. Further, Mr. Speaker, going forward, the National Treasury may withhold exchequer releases to the MDAs or SAGAs with pending bills until an approved payment plan for all pending bills is agreed upon. Mr. Speaker, the continued growth and competitiveness of our financial services sector is critical in supporting economic development. I wish to state that our financial sector remains strong and stable despite the shocks occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the banking sector remains stable and resilient, with strong liquidity and capital adequacy ratios. The Central Bank of Kenya has been closely monitoring the sector to identify vulnerabilities, especially those associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The bank has been at the forefront and has rolled out various policy and regulatory measures to support the sector. Mr. Speaker, during the last 1 year, the government, through Central Bank of Kenya, rolled out a mobile-based service to facilitate retail investors participate in government securities, a convenience to investors during this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, in order to strengthen our position as regional financial hub, the National Treasury is in the process of operationalizing the Nairobi International Financial Center. The center will play an important role in attracting investments and private capital to support economic growth, as well as mobilizing additional financing for the Big Four projects and further providing new financing options for Kenyan businesses. Mr. Speaker, to enhance the safety and integrity of our financial system, the National Treasury, together with other stakeholders, will conduct Kenya's first national risk assessment on money laundering and terrorism financing. This will assist the country's competent authorities to assign responsibilities for combating money laundering and terrorism financing to the relevant government agencies on the basis of identified risks and vulnerabilities. Mr. Speaker, the high cost of housing units and limited access to affordable long-term finance remain a leading house market constraint. To address this challenge, the government established the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company, whose main purpose is to provide long-term funds to primary housing mortgage providers in the housing sector. In this regard, the company will offer fixed-rate long-term loans at concessional rates to mortgage providers who are expected to pass the benefit to citizens at a lower than market rates. The company has raised capital of Kenyan 2 billion, while the National Treasury has mobilized additional Kenyan 35 billion from development partners to support the company's operations. Mr. Speaker, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company will help to maintain adequate liquidity among primary housing mortgage providers in order to keep housing finance and the housing market functioning. This will avert potential credit crunch that will hurt lower-income households and interrupt efforts to support affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, the new company is also expected to play a significant role in the structuring of the proposed National Credit Guarantee Scheme in order to create an effective backstop mortgage guarantee component to cover the losses incurred by the lenders on future home loans. Mr. Speaker, in the year 2015, the investment guidelines under the retirement benefits regulations were amended to allow pension schemes to invest up to 10% of their assets in private equity funds and venture capital funds licensed by the Capital Markets Authority. However, the Capital Markets Act was not amended to provide for regulations of this private equity and the venture capital. In this regard, I have proposed amendment to the Capital Markets Act to provide for the regulation of private equity and venture capital companies by the authority. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I propose to amend the Capital Markets Act to remove the function of payment of beneficiaries from collected and claimed dividends, since these are functions currently domiciled and an unclaimed financial assets authority. Mr. Speaker, the increase in public pension budget and accumulation of pension claims remain a challenge. In this regard, the National Treasury is re-engineering and upgrading the pension systems in order to clear all pension payments backlog by the end of the calendar year. This will pave way for modernized pension management system that will guarantee smooth transition of retirees from a monthly salary check to a monthly pension payment. To ease the pension burden on the exchequer, the National Treasury is committed to roll out the Public Service Superannuation Scheme in the financial year 2020-21. Further, Mr. Speaker, to support the pension sector in general, the government is developing a national retirement benefits policy that will harmonize all pension laws. This will strengthen the legal and regulatory framework to achieve a comprehensive pension coverage across the formal and informal sectors and better protect the interests of beneficiaries and rights of pension contributors. Mr. Speaker, in September 2019, this House approved the County Government Retirement Scheme, which provides for the establishment of an umbrella retirement scheme for county government. Thereafter, petitions were filed in courts challenging the law, thus paralyzing its operation. To this effect, the National Treasury undertakes to pursue all legal means to resolve this matter and ensure that county government employees have a scheme that safeguards members' pensions. Mr. Speaker, further, the government is working on establishing a national micro-pension scheme with a sustainable model that combines long-term saving with short-term needs that will be open to all marginalized informal workers who constitute over 80% of Kenya's labor force. Mr. Speaker, the Retirement Benefits Authority Act does not provide for sanction in case of failure or delay in submission of the actuarial valuation reports within the specified period. In this regard, I propose to amend the Retirement Benefits Authority Act to impose a penalty to pension schemes who fail to submit actuarial valuation reports to the authority within the specified timeline. The actuarial valuation reports are important in determining the performance of the scheme. Mr. Speaker, framework for responding to disasters in Kenya are fragmented across laws. These have hampered the ability of government to respond to disasters more effectively. To address this challenge, the government will develop a harmonized disaster risk management legal framework to guide the management of disasters in Kenya. To this end, we shall also finalize the Disaster Management Fund regulations to facilitate effective and efficient response to disasters in a more coordinated manner. Mr. Speaker, globally, climate change is a key concern, like other countries. The Kenyan economy is vulnerable to its effects. Over the last 10 years, we have experienced increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather. Mr. Speaker, in order to minimize the adverse effects of this phenomenon on the economy, we need to pursue a green economic development path. In this regard, the National Treasury proposed to tap into the green climate financing by issuing the first sovereign green bond to finance major infrastructure projects in the financial 2020-21. These proceeds will be directed towards green projects at both the national and county level. Mr. Speaker, execution of the budget for 2019-2020 has progressed well despite the challenges of reduced revenue performance. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only worsened revenue performance in 2019-2020, but will affect revenue in 2020-21 budget. In particular, import-related taxes such as import duty, VAT on imports, import declaration fees, and rural development levy have been negatively affected due to lower imports and reduction of trade among countries. Further, other domestic taxes have been severely affected by declining incomes and depressed consumptions. As noted earlier in my statement, in order to cushion Kenyans against the adverse impact of the pandemic and to further increase liquidity in the economy, the government lowered tax rates for corporate and personal incomes, turnover tax, value-added tax, and provided tax relief to low-income earners and employees. These measures are estimated to cost the exchequer Kenya 172 billion in revenue foregone by government in one financial year. Mr. Speaker, in order to recoup part of this revenue laws, we submitted this House proposals to lower the level of tax exemptions. It is important to note that in the year 2018, the tax revenue foregone by government through tax incentives, or for that matter exemptions, amounted to Kenya shilling 535 billion, or 6% of GDP, which is considered one of the highest levels globally. Whereas these tax incentives are well intended, they have limited the capacity of government to fund critical expenditures. In addition, a critical review of the incentive shows that consumers have not benefited through commensurate reduction in cost of the goods and services. Further, some of these incentives have given undue advantage to some sector players over others, thus entrenching unfairness and stifling competition. Mr. Speaker, this therefore necessitated a review of the existing laws incentive regime with a view to minimizing distortions and providing a level playing ground for all taxpayers. In this respect, I have proposed further removal of some existing tax exemptions through the Finance Bill 2020. I urge honorable members of this House to support this endeavor for revenues for funding critical social and infrastructure programs. Mr. Speaker, the Kenya Revenue Authority has undertaken various reforms to enhance revenue mobilization. We shall continue to support and strengthen the capacity of the Kenya Revenue Authority to enable them collect revenues to fund government programs. Mr. Speaker, the fiscal framework for 2020-21 budget and the medium term has been revised to take into account the adverse impacts of the pandemic on revenue performance. In this respect, the 2020-21 budget targets revenue collection, including appropriation in aid, of Kenya shilling 1.89 trillion, which is equivalent to 16.8% of GDP. This is a stagnation from the estimated revenues of Kenya shilling 1.89 trillion, equivalent to 18.6% of GDP in the financial year 2019-2020. Of these, ordinary revenues in the financial year 2020-21 are projected at Kenya shilling 1.63 trillion, equivalent to 14.5% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, total expenditures in the financial year 2020 projected at Kenya shilling 2.79 trillion, or 24.7% of GDP, from the estimated levels of Kenya shilling 2.77 trillion, or 27.2% of GDP in 2019-2020. The recurrent expenditures in the financial year 2020-21 will amount to Kenya shilling 1.82 trillion, or 16.2% of GDP. On the other hand, ministerial development expenditures that include foreign finance projects, allocation to contingency funds, and conditional capital transfers to the county government are projected at Kenya shilling 633.1 billion in 2020 critical infrastructure in the budget. Mr. Speaker, taking into account the projected revenues and expenditure in the financial year 2020-21, the fiscal deficit, including grants, is projected to decline to Kenya shilling 840.6 billion, or 7.5% of GDP, from Kenya shilling 842.7 billion, or 8.3% of GDP in the financial 2019-2020. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, as we roll out the post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy, we remain committed to gradually lowering the fiscal deficit to Kenya shilling 768.8 billion, or 6.1% of GDP in the financial year 2021-22, and further to Kenya shilling 570.4 billion, or 3.6% of GDP by 2023-24. In the financial year 2020-21, the fiscal deficit of Kenya shilling 840.6 billion will be financed through net external financing of Kenya shilling 347 billion, or 3.1% of GDP, net financing of Kenya shilling 493.4 billion, or 4.4% of GDP, and other net domestic repayment of Kenya shilling 627 million. Mr. Speaker, to achieve these targets, we will continue to contain growth in non-core recurrent spending and enhance our efforts in revenue mobilization. In this respect, we shall closely monitor the economic impact of COVID-19, and once the economy recovers, we'll review our fiscal plan, including tax measures, to strengthen public finances to sustainably fund our development agenda. Mr. Speaker, the government is concerned about perennial low absorption of donor funds that has denied Kenyans the full benefit of this financing. To remove impediments in the project's implementation and scale up absorption of donor funds, the government will put in place appropriate policies and administrative measures. These may involve reallocation of funds from slow-moving projects or non-startup projects to other priority projects and programs to minimize payments of unnecessary fees and charges. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the state of our public debt. Our debt remains sustainable despite some of the debt burden indicators deteriorating due to impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has elevated expenditure pressures, reduced revenues, and export earnings. The debt burden is projected to decline over the medium term in line with the fiscal consolidation plan and implementation. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to implement the 2020 medium-term debt strategy, which recommends a shift towards concessional external borrowing and lengthening of maturity structure of the domestic debt. In addition, the debt and borrowing policy approved in early 2020 will guide management of public debt. Mr. Speaker, as an alternative source of finance to fund public projects, the government shall revitalize the public-private partnership framework. Indeed, public-private partnerships have the potential to accelerate economic growth and development by crowding in private sector participation in the financing of capital-intensive infrastructure projects. Mr. Speaker, the reforms in this area will include amending the PPP Act to remove unnecessary approvals and redundant processes, as well as restructure and strengthen institutions responsible for implementing such projects. The government will also streamline and standardize the appropriate credit enhancement tool, including the government letter of support, partial risk guarantees, and indemnity guarantees, as well as viability gap funding where necessary, to enhance bankability of projects. Mr. Speaker, the government, through these arrangements, targets to mobilize approximately $200 billion in the financial 2020-21 by concluding the financing of several projects that are currently at advanced stage of negotiation. These projects are drawn from, among others, the transport, energy, health, housing, and manufacturing sectors of the economy. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the highlights of the government spending priorities in the coming financial year. The total program spending for the financial 2020-21, excluding redemptions, amounts to shilling 2.79 trillion. Mr. Speaker, the budget for financial 2020-21 will continue the implementation of the Big Four agenda. Thus, the targeted expenditures prioritize employment creation, youth empowerment, supporting manufacturing activities, enhancing health coverage, improving food security, and living conditions through affordable housing. To support these initiatives, I have set aside shilling 128.3 billion for the Big Four agenda drivers and enablers. The government continues to prioritize healthcare by scaling up universal health coverage to all the counties. To improve health outcomes, I have proposed an allocation of shilling 111.7 billion to the health sector in this budget. Out of this, shilling 50.3 billion is for activities and programs for the attainment of universal health coverage by the drivers and enablers. Mr. Speaker, the budget for the health sector includes shilling 19.2 billion to address and lower cases of HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis in the country. Shilling 6.2 billion for the managed service equipment. Shilling 5.3 billion to transform the healthcare systems for universal health coverage, shilling 4.1 billion to cater for free maternity health care, and shilling 1.8 billion to provide medical cover for the elderly and severely disabled in our society. Mr. Speaker, other allocations to improve health service delivery includes shilling 15 billion for Kenyatta National Hospital, shilling 10 billion for the Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital, shilling 7.2 billion for Kenya Medical Training Centers, Kenya shilling 2.5 billion for the Kenya Medical Research Institute, Kenya shilling 1.2 billion to Madari Hospital, and Kenya shilling 4.3 billion as a conditional grant to level 5 hospitals in the counties. Mr. Speaker, to ensure the success of affordable housing program, the government continues to forge partnerships with the private sector and development partners. In this budget, I have proposed an allocation of Kenya shilling 15.5 billion to the housing, urban development, and public works sector. Out of these, Kenya shilling 6.9 billion will cater for the affordable housing program undertaken by the driver and enablers. We are also concluding discussions to bring on board an additional Kenya shilling 3.6 billion from the African Development Bank, Kenya shilling 7.5 billion for the Kenya Urban Program, and Kenya shilling 1.1 billion for the ongoing construction of Gikomba, Githurai, Chaka, Kamkunji, and Agoreti markets. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to scale up reforms to promote investment in the manufacturing sector to support and protect local industries. To promote local industries, I have proposed an allocation of Kenya shilling 18.3 billion for this cluster. Of these, Kenya shilling 1.4 billion will go to the Kenya Industrial Entrepreneurship Project, Kenya shilling 3.5 billion for the development of Special Economic Zone, Textile Park in Naivasha, Kenanie Leather Industrial Park, and at the River Textile Hub. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I have set aside Kenya shilling 843 million to support modernization of Rivertex, Kenya shilling 800 million for the development of various micro, small, and medium enterprises in Kenya, Kenya shilling 715 million for the Kenya Youth Empowerment and Opportunities Project, Kenya shilling 500 million to support the dairy processing, and Kenya shilling 3 billion for the Ongokundu Special Economic Zone. Mr. Speaker, the government remains committed to reducing the number of food insecure Kenyans. Towards this end, the government will continue to expand irrigation schemes, support large-scale production of staples, increase access to